Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of what is a very special CAS 360 educational week we have in store for you. My name is Norman. I'm the training lead here at BGL, and I'll be your host for this session, where in the next 20 or 30 minutes or so, we're going to be covering Director IDs and asking you, are you ready for Director IDs? Now, we have a lot of content to cover, but I do know from past experience that Director IDs generally garners a lot of questions. So I brought along with me a bunch of my colleagues to help me out and help you with any of the questions that you have. So I've got Emily, Daniel, and Anthony, who are also product trainers here at BGL. They run training sessions such as this, and you'll meet them throughout the week for those attending multiple sessions. They also run the hands-on training as well. And on top of that, they're also responsible for writing the training manuals and with writing the help articles you see on the help knowledge base as well. And they also do the informative articles like the Director ID article that we have on the Knowledge Center. Also, I've got Virginia and Jeremy, who are part of the CAS 360 product team. So they test and also introduce the new features, but they also help with speccing out the product and determine what needs to go in it. And part of that is also having a comprehensive understanding of the rules, the regulations, and of the legislation that is introduced in your profession, including Director IDs. So there's a lot of knowledge at your fingertips. So if you have any questions, at any time, we encourage questions, let us know in the Q&A panel in your Zoom application, and we'll be able to answer your questions. Also, the webinar is recorded, and we'll be posting it up on our YouTube channel shortly after the end of today's session. Now, just in case, we'll send you an email and we'll blog it on the community just to let you know when that's available. So have a look out for that, and have a look out for our YouTube channel for those for this recording. Now, with that being said, let's get right into it. Now, before we talk about the features in CAS 360 around Director IDs, I thought it'd be good to talk a little bit about what Director IDs are. Now, if you weren't aware, Director IDs were introduced in November of 2021, and they were introduced by the ABRS. Now, what are the ABRS? The ABRS is a new government body that was created to manage and are responsible for the company registers. If you've been in corporate compliance for a while or even new to it, you've been dealing with ASIC. They have been currently and in the past responsible for company registers, but that responsibility is going to be moved over to this new body, which is the ABRS. Now, reason for that is because the ABRS, hopefully, will be much more prepared to handle all this new company register information going forward, especially coming to an environment where everything is going to be online and more technology is going to be attributed to managing company registrations or company registers. Now, the Director ID itself is a unique identifier. That means it's going to be like a number that's assigned to a director, and a director is going to keep that number forever. Now, a director will only need to apply and receive one Director ID, regardless of how many companies that person is going to be a director for. Okay, so they only need one Director ID. And also, all directors are required to verify their identity with the ABRS before receiving their Director ID. So they will go to the ABRS, just verify their details, just prove that they are who they are before they get the Director ID. Now let's talk about deadlines and who needs to apply. Now, in terms of who needs to apply, as the name suggests, Director IDs, it's going to be directors. So directors and alternate directors are the ones that need to apply for a Director ID. That also includes directors that have a foreign address as well. So they'll also have to apply for a Director IDs. Also, Notice that there's no talk of secretaries there. So secretaries are going to be exempt from it. So they don't need a director ID, just the directors and the alternate directors. Now, in terms of deadlines, so we can group those deadlines in 3 different groups. So the first group is going to be directors appointed or people appointed as directors before the 31st of October of last year. These directors will have up until the 30th of November 2022 to apply for a director ID. Now, between the 1st of November and the 4th of April, anyone appointed as a director, any new directors appointed in that time frame, are going to have 28 days to apply for a director ID from the date of their appointment. And finally, last group is going to be anyone appointed as a director after 5th of April and onwards. Before anybody can become a director or a director itself for a company, they will need a director ID first before they're appointed. Okay. Now, people have questions around how this kind of works or test cases, and luckily enough, the ABRS has started to provide some test cases or example scenarios of what you might come across and how the dates kind of apply. And here's the 2 that I've got on screen there, and I've got a link there that you can head to, and I'll post it in a moment as well that you can view. But the first scenario is going to be Louise. Louise has been a director for a number of years, well before the 31st of October of last year. So she would have until the 30th of November 2022 to apply for a director ID. But in our second scenario is Romy. So Romy is very similar. Romy has been a director for many years, let's say, well before the 31st of October 2021. And same with Louise, he has until the 30th of November 2022 of this year to apply for the director ID. However, if we look at the third paragraph, Romy expects to be appointed as a director of another company in 2022. When this happens, he doesn't need to apply for another director ID. If he hasn't applied for a director ID when he's appointed of the other company, he still has until 30th of November 2022 to apply. Okay, so we get a lot of questions around this. So what if there's an existing director and what if they're appointed throughout the year for another company? Does that change the deadline for that person? But here from these scenarios, it says that it does not. Okay, so if you want to view a whole bunch of these other scenarios, definitely head to the ABRS website and you'll be able to read through a bunch of the other scenarios that they have examples for. So hopefully that clarifies some of the questions that you might have already had. Now, because there are deadlines, there's got to be a consequence attached to those deadlines, and they come in the form of fines and penalties. And unfortunately, they are pretty hefty. So the first, I guess, fine is failure to have a director ID. So we know the deadlines now. We know that directors have to apply for a director ID. So if they don't apply for the director ID in time, they are up for massive fines. We can see them. Also, the next stage is failure to apply for director ID when directed by the register. So if the ABRS sends them a letter saying, hey, you need a director ID, and they still don't get one, then they're up for a fine, a potential fine there. Thirdly, applying for multiple director IDs. Okay, so as I mentioned before, each director can only have one director ID and they will keep that director ID forever, and regardless of how many companies they become a director for. Okay, and you can see there that's even more fines and potential imprisonment for that. And lastly, misrepresenting a director. Okay, now we don't have a test case for this happening, but it does talk about, well, I guess what our belief is, it has something to do with either making up the director ID or using somebody else's director ID that is not their own. Okay, so that is a serious penalty there. Now, I will mention, as of yet, we haven't found a case where somebody has been fined. However, as the 28-day deadline has already been met, it's well past April, over a month past the April deadline. They can by all means start applying these fines. So the faster the directors can get a director ID, the better. Okay, although they haven't issued any fines yet, I wouldn't, let's say, test their luck. Okay, so how does somebody apply for a director ID? Now, there are three methods for applying for a director ID. Now, the first one is applying online via the MyGov ID app. And this will be what most directors will be using to apply for a director ID. Now, all these methods are going to be listed in the ABRS website. And also, when we talk about the features within the software itself, we'll show you links that are provided to your clients about how to apply and where to go to apply. Also, they've got the option to apply by phone, and finally apply by paper form itself. Now, I will mention with applying for a director ID, it has to be done by the director themselves. So they can't get somebody to apply for an ID on their behalf. So you can't go apply for a director. They can't get, a spouse or a relative or a friend to apply for them. They have to do it themselves. So whether they log in online or they call up the ABRS or they fill in the form to apply for it. You can, however, help them out, provide them the information that they need to fulfill that application, or even do a bit of hand holding, whether that's staying on the phone with them and or kind of looking over their shoulder to help them with what they need to do to get a director ID. Okay. So how can CAS 360 help you? So inbuilt in CAS 360 are a whole bunch of different features that we've included to help you spread the word about director IDs, notify your clients, the directors, about their obligations for obtaining a director ID, and also reinforcing that as well, but also giving you options to fill those details in and save them within CAS 360. So we've got them listed there. We've got the director ID alert and reminder emails. So you'll find this in the company screen, and I'll show it to you in a little moment, where you can hover over the alerts and see if the person, or you've entered the person's ID details within CAS 360, but also you can send an email from CAS 360 saying, hey, you need to get a director ID, and also providing links within there that they can click on and go through the process of applying for a director ID. We've also added letters to the annual review process. So in the annual review screen itself, you'll see another alert in there, but also a letter as part of the document set that will be sent to your clients to notify them about what director IDs are. We've also included a director ID report in the report screen. The report screen will have this report, which will produce an Excel spreadsheet listing the directors' names, also the email addresses if you've entered them in, and also the director ID if you've saved that into CAS 360. But also we've added fields in the incorporation screen starting off, which will extend to other screens going forward. So you'll see this now if you're doing incorporations in CAS 360. When you add a new director or new person in that screen, it will have a field to enter in the director ID for that person. Okay, so we've started off with that screen, but that will extend further on as we go with future updates to other screens like the officer screens and things like that. Okay, but we'll show you this now. Let's flip over to CAS 360. Okay, so here we've got CAS 360, and we'll go through the, first feature that I was talking about just before, and that's the director ID alert. Now, where you'll see this screen is from here. We've got the person icon, which is for our director IDs. So if you hover over that, you can see an option to go to director IDs. Now, if we look at the left-hand menu, we can see a filter for those director IDs. You can see that it filters between the deadline dates that I was talking about before. So you've got the required in 28 days, you've got the required by November, you've got the overdue, and you've also got the complete as well. Okay. Now, obviously by clicking on the filters, you can filter your company list by those deadlines. Now, if you look at the one that's been completed, and completed just indicates that your clients have got a director ID and they have provided it to you, and you've been able to enter it into CAS 360. Now, that's important because ideally you want to be saving these director IDs in your CAS 360 software, so it's ready to go for when the ABRS starts taking over the company registers. If it's under overdue or required by 30th of November, you'll have either the yellow alerts or the maroon alert. And if you hover over those alerts, you've got the option to go to Director ID. This will open up this Director ID window, which allow you to view the directors for the company. If we look at the top of the screen, we can see that you've got a notify all directors. By clicking on send now, this will allow you to email or send an email to the directors of the company, so all the directors listed below, saying, hey, this is your director ID requirements. So these are some new obligations that you need to do. Or contain this button here within the email that they can click on to get a bit more information about director IDs. And then finally, you've got how to get a director ID, which they will click on, or take them to the ABRS website where they can then start the process of obtaining their director ID. Okay, so it's all contained within that email itself. Once you're happy with it, you can click on send. That'll send that email off to the directors of the company. Also, you've got other options within that director ID screen. Beside each director, you've also got listed the email address for that director. So before you send the email out, you can quickly check the emails that you've entered into the CAS 360 software to ensure that it is correct. And if you do need to make any changes, you can always hover over the eye icon. That'll allow you to check the more details as well. And you can also go to the contact and edit any of those details. Now, on the right-hand side, you've got send reminder. Send reminder will allow you to email just that individual director. Okay, so, you might send that initial email, that will send it to all directors. But if there's one particular or a couple of directors within that particular company that's giving you a little bit of a hard time, you can continually send them an email saying, hey, go get your director ID and please provide it to me. Okay, now that's very important. You want your clients, the directors of the companies, to also not only apply for the director ID, but also send it back to you. So if your client says, hey, I've applied for my director ID, instead of saying, okay, great, good job, give them a pat on the back, you should be asking them, hey, that's great, but what is your director ID? Please provide it to me. Once you receive the director ID, you can enter it into the software by clicking add director ID and start typing the director ID here. Now, as I mentioned before, it's important because once the ABRS takes over, they've got their new systems in place. It's all going to tie in with this director ID. So you want to have the director ID saved within your software so it's ready to go for when those new systems come into play. Now, once you enter those details for those directors for the company, this alert is going to turn into a green alert. Now, as far as the other features go, as I mentioned before, another feature was the annual review process. So from the left-hand menu, we're going to head over to reviews and we're going to the annual review screen. Now, in our annual review screen, we've also added the director ID alert within the screen too. So not only is it in the company screen, but it's also in the review screen as well. And it works the same way here. And this will help you ensure that whether your client has the ID or not. and whether you've entered into the software. Also, as part of this process, we've included a letter within the document production screen. So when you click on Prepare Documents for Annual Reviews, you will see a ABRS Director letter. Okay, so this is what the letter looks like. And as part of the set of documents that you would send out normally for an annual review, you can also include the ABRS letter as well. Just notify them of their obligations to get a Director ID. Now, as far as the report, we've also added a Director ID report. So from the left-hand menu, under Reports, you've got the Director ID report. Now, the Director ID report, if I bring it up on screen, as I mentioned before, it's going to be a spreadsheet containing the directors' names, directors' details, but it will also include the Director ID in those fields there if they have been provided, and if they have not, then obviously it will be a blank field there. Okay, so that's what the spreadsheet looks like. So we know that some people prefer spreadsheets. They find it easier to kind of manage details and for their processes. So what we've done is we've added a report that gets exported as an Excel spreadsheet. Now, lastly, another feature that we've also added is we've started to include fields for the Director ID within certain processes. For now, we've added it to the incorporation process, but in future updates, see that also extend to other processes as well. So I'll show you what that kind of looks like. Under your company screen, when we do company registrations, when you go through the process of entering the registration details and you start getting into the officer details, and you start entering an officer details for the first time, you will start seeing the fields there for the Director ID. Okay, so that's what it'll look like. So when you're entering the person's birth details, phone number, email address, and things like that, you will also have the opportunity to also enter the Director ID. Okay. So again, that's a whole bunch of features that we've entered into the software itself, included into your CAS 360 that you have available to you. And again, as I mentioned before, there's going to be more features that we're going to enter in the future. So we're going to look at where it's going to be affected, or in how that's going to affect officer appointments in the future, and then we'll look to incorporate those fields into those processes as well. So I've mentioned this before, but we'll talk finally about deadlines. As far as deadlines go, again, as of April 5th, you can't appoint a new director for a company without the Director ID. So you now have to change your processes in terms of, if somebody comes to you saying, hey, I want to be a director, you now have to include that, hey, this person needs a Director ID first before you can start producing the documents for that appointment. And then finally, you've got after 30th of November 2022, every director from that date onwards would need a Director ID. Okay, so that would be the last deadline date, 30th of November of this year. That day onwards, they would need a Director ID. Okay, so that comes to the end of the content today. I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. Really do appreciate. So we're going to open up for questions. So send your questions through. We're happy to clarify them. Again, we've got a lot of knowledge here on the Q&A, so send that through.